Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery, preparing to check in on a couple worm bins. These are my so-called original red wiggler worms. The worms have been in these bins for 94 days now, and they've been fed 8 times. So today, after 11 days since the most recent check-in, I think they're due for another feeding. So I'm going to get a glove on. We're going to get these little guys up onto the bench and see how they're doing. And I got some yummy food for them too, so let's get to work. During our last check-in, we gave them what we referred to as a boost of bedding. So we gave them a little bit of my prepared bedding sprinkled in beneath the feeding. There were a couple paper towels placed in beneath the feeding. Today, rather than paper-based stuff, I thought I would break out my supply of leaves from outside because I have trees on my property and I collect the leaves each year, but I've been a little bit neglectful in trying to do away with my collection of leaves. And we're pretty much at the end of summer now, and it's just a matter of time before the leaves start dropping their trees start dropping their leaves again. And I've still got so many leaves piled up from last autumn that it just seems unlikely that I'll actually finish using them all. So I thought perhaps we'd get back to using leaves as bedding. We're also going to use these top covering pieces of newspaper as bedding in the feeding as well, because this one got beaten up pretty good. You can even see the stripe that we laid down. I think we laid down worm chow diagonally across both bins to try to promote worms coming out to nibble on the top covering. And here too you can see a little bit of that activity, but over this side, well, yeah, you could see it. I guess it was not so visible because of the piece of paper beneath it. I could see a cocoon over here. Sometimes you spot cocoons sitting out on top of the material, but sometimes what you're actually seeing are these little tiny curled up millipedes. Unless you look closely, you can easily confuse the two for each other. And you know, I shouldn't take such care in preserving the feeding zone indicators because, I mean, even though they're in great shape and they could certainly go one more round in this bin if we needed them to, I've got replacements for these. So we'll just use those as supplemental bedding too when we get around to feeding. So I'm just going to set aside all of these pieces of paper so that when we get around to feeding, we'll be able to utilize this stuff down in the feeding area. Last time they got an assortment of different things, and I believe that one of the main things that they got was an entire corn cob. So I'll be curious to see how those are coming along. After 11 days, it's likely that there's not a lot of progress. It is really nice to see all this bedding material out here. I mean, fresh castings material out here. I think at the end too, since I've got my leaves out and we're going to use that as some of the bedding for the feeding zone today, I thought maybe we would do something that I do once in a while, which is sort of top coat the entire system with even more leafy material at the end, giving the whole system a nice earthy kind of appearance, which is kind of cool. So down here at the bottom of the feeding zone, we might even bump into some leftovers of the shredded paper and cardboard that we placed in here, because we put a couple handfuls into each system, but I'm really not seeing a whole lot of it. I mean, I think maybe here we could see a couple fragments of it, but it does actually look like they did quite a number on this stuff. All right, so down here is some of the leftover corn cob that they got. There were no kernels on it, so this is pretty much the way they received it. Usually the worms will start burrowing through the middle portion of a corn cob because the middle piece of it is a little bit more tender than the rest of the cob, which is very fibrous and tough. But I doubt that that corn cob is fragile enough yet for us to start breaking it up into little pieces. Something I rarely do is break up the corn cobs in my worm bins when I encounter them. I usually just leave them to break down over time, but even here are a couple fragments of some corn cob that go way back. They've probably been here in these bins for some time now. I sort of decided last week or so that maybe it's time to actually start helping these pieces of corn cob break down by actually breaking them into smaller pieces when we are able to. Because after a little while, they do become pretty easy to break, even though in the beginning they might not be. Like even here, I don't know if we'd be able to break these in half. Yeah, it actually went pretty easily. And it does look like they've not yet made it to the middle. But by breaking it in half, we'll give them direct access to the middle. So that's always kind of one of the things to do in your worm bins. If you want the worms to be able to break things down more quickly, is to fragment the things that you're giving them into smaller and smaller pieces, so that each piece has more surface area in the end, providing worms with a greater surface area for that object, for them to approach it from even more directions, and help it break down more quickly that way. And in the past, I always figured it would be kind of a novelty to leave corn cobs to just break down at their own natural pace. But this year I've got just so many corn cobs piling up in the freezer. In the past I would usually just take them out into the outdoor compost barrel and let them break down out there. But lately I've been preserving more of them and keeping them in my freezer for worm bin feedings down here. But if I follow my old method of just keeping them untouched and unhelped, I'll just have corn cobs laying around in my worm bins forever, making very slow progress on the breakdown. But if we help them along a little bit, I think that'll increase the pace at which they get consumed by the worms. So let's come in here with some of the bedding that I bought down here for them. Well, I didn't bring it down. I bought it down maybe a month ago, but it's hardly even been used. I've been really neglecting my supply of leaves from outside ever since I got these nice fancy shredders. I've been shredding paper for my worm bins for a couple years now, and I've sort of gotten out of the habit of using leaves directly. I mean, the leaves always do make their way into my prepared bedding, but nowadays it seems like I so rarely use this stuff just straight out of the box like this. But I know that the worms love it. They probably prefer that over any other bedding out there. And as you can see, the stuff is going in dry. And that's okay, I think, because the material does feel like it's got a pretty good moisture content to it. So the rest of the bin will help, that stuff hydrate and become nice and damp so that the worms can start cruising around in it again. And in the beginning, they're not going to be able to approach this because of the dryness. But in a fairly short period of time, the stuff will dampen and the worms will be able to come in here and start nibbling the food. I mean, they'll be able to sense the delicious foods we're placing in here for them. And the delicious foods are also going to kick off a little bit of moisture since they're all frozen. And as they thaw, they're going to, start emitting a little bit of their moisture content into the bin. So I'm sure within a couple days, the worms will start to approach the food supply in here. But in the very beginning, I think all but the most brave wormies are going to be able to make it into here. It's interesting, when something sits in my freezer for a really long time, it starts to become quite dry. It's almost like it's becoming freeze-dried or something, I think if that's the right expression for it. So I believe that a refrigerator does have a tendency to suck the moisture out of things. And sometimes when I leave things in the freezer for a long time, if they're not in a plastic bag or something to help the material hang on to its moisture content, sometimes it comes out of the freezer quite dry, oddly enough. So here, these sort of things would have been stored in bags, so they wouldn't have been exposed directly to the freezer air, which is rather dry. Most of the stuff I put aside for the worms is in bags, but not everything. Sometimes when I eat a banana, I just throw it into the little container I've got in the freezer to just sit there and wait until I have a chance to feed it to the worms. But most everything else I put aside is in bags, just so it's easy to grab it and go. But then I always hang on to those bags and I reuse them as much as I can. To me, it just seems like kind of a waste to, throw things away if they could still be reused, especially when you're vermicomposting and you're really sort of in pursuit of making things, you know, either last or get used up in the worm bins. Even my gloves, I try to get as many uses out of my gloves until they break, basically. Which I hope everyone does if they're using disposable rubber gloves in your worm bins. So we definitely put in a lot of bedding, and after adding the food, we're almost at the surface here. But I hope that we'll be able to just till up what's on the outskirts of each bin and kind of fluff it all up and give ourselves enough material to easily cover up the feeding zones here. So why don't we do that? Let's start over here in bin number 1. Sort of till up the outskirts of the bin and bring it in to the middle to cover up the feeding zone. At the same time, we're also getting a little glimpse into how things are doing out here in the outer reaches of the bin. Things look pretty nice out here. The material does have a pretty good moisture content, so I think between the foods themselves emitting some of their moisture content as they thaw, combined with just the, you know, the somewhat damp contents of the system sharing some of its moisture content with the dry leaves we just added, hopefully those leaves will dampen up to the point where the worms can easily adopt this stuff as bedding and then eventually make use of it as food as well. Because basically anything that you use as bedding in your worm bins does eventually just turn into their food supply too. So bedding is pretty much a food. But in the beginning, you know, the stuff serves as a medium for the worms to live in, especially when you're starting out new. You know, the worms need something to live in. And I think we've definitely got enough to easily cover up the feeding zones at this point, because we've not even tilled up the edge that's closer to you yet. And it seems like we've already quite easily covered up our feeding zone. Yeah, everything in here looks quite nice. Both systems have a nice moisture content to them. And sometimes when I start to feel like maybe systems are starting to get a little bit too damp for my liking, I'll occasionally, you know, begin putting a different type of top covering. I would, you know, eliminate the plastic. That'll be my first course of actions to, you know, not let the system hang on to what I consider to be excess moisture. I would start out by providing them with a porous paper-based top covering to let the moisture start just gradually working its way out of the system through evaporation. And then the other thing is to also be able to just add, you know, a whole bunch of dry material. In this case, the dry material was simply placed beneath the food, but if we were dealing with some stuff that was starting to seem like it's getting a little bit muddy, we could have easily just blended in all that dry bedding into the material to help it sort of act as a sponge to absorb some of the moisture in the surrounding areas. But here I think everything's in really great shape, so there's no real need to react to the moisture content. For systems that are less than 100 days of age too, I mean, it's probably to the benefit of the system to have perhaps a little bit more moisture content so that the worms are able to take full advantage of all the real estate in the system and not feel like they're unable to approach certain areas due to dryness. So it seems like we could have possibly even added a little bit more, but this will be fine. We'll just go with this. I'm going to use our nice new feeding zone indicators to show ourselves where the feeding zone was positioned, right down the middle. And then something we did last time, which you saw the evidence of when we first got in here, was the worm chow getting sprinkled out onto the top covering newspaper. I kind of get a kick out of that, you know. I like to see the top covering newspaper getting used by the worms, not as only a place to just hang out when they come up for the moisture collecting on the top covering plastic, but also to utilize it as a source of food, you know. So I think maybe we'll do the same. I've got these replacement pieces of top covering paper that are going to come right back out on top. And then before we replace the plastic, we'll do what we did last time, is we'll put another diagonal line across the paper so that when they do come out to nibble on the worm chow, they'll be compelled to also take a little bite out of the paper too. And I don't know why, I'm just going with a diagonal stripe across. I think just because it's such a simple, obvious shape that it's very easily recognizable when we come back in to see if what we had set up did its intended thing. So I think that'll do quite nicely for them. Let's get the plastic coverings in, then we'll be finished. Pretty sure I saw worms hanging out on some of these plastic covers when we removed them. And it was this one, I believe, that I saw worms in between the bubbles. That was the reason I chose this one to place the top coverings on until we had a chance to use them as bedding down the feeding area. But I don't see any worms. Maybe we managed to knock them off before we got the plastic out of the bin. So hopefully the little guy didn't get lost somewhere on my table. I'll definitely look when we're done. All right, everyone, we are done. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.